Since the Vampire Cop series has been the most liked on this channel, which I'm incredibly grateful for by the way, it only makes sense for me to dive deeper into the vampire lore that I have created. In Book 1 Season 1, we've encountered 6 main types of villains: Dracula, Anne-Marie, Mercer, the Wizards of Three, and the Vampire Hunters, along with Nazdukh, the Vampire Elder. This is part 1 of their origin stories, focusing on Nazdukh, the Vampire Elder, Mercer Vexley, the Vampire Mercenary, and the Vampire Hunters. Now do keep in mind these are villains, hence their backstories are vile, cruel, and most definitely not for the faint-hearted. The last chapter in the Vampire Cop series saw Dracula and Mercer watching Fesliyan Hunt chase after the hybrids. The conversation between Vampire Lord and Mercenary revealed shocking information. There was a technique the Vampire Cop used which allowed him to travel faster by turning into a wisp of dark smoke. Dracula too shared the same power, but he left behind a trail of red smoke. Mercer noticed this and made the terrifying observation, which also became the explanation as to why both him and Dracula did not chase after the Vampire Cop. That particular ability or technique was only shared with the Vampire Elder, the first and most terrifying vampire in history's existence, Nazdukh. Before he became Nazdukh, Zalkath Drakovich was one of the most powerful priest kings under the ancient gods. He would expel demons with mere words, and those who were stronger faced his wrath, all thanks to the divine, of course. Those demons, who were far more terrifying and fearsome, would tear through the flesh of the possessed victim and manifest themselves in their true form. This never bothered Zalkath, not one bit. All his weapons were anointed with holy water and oil. They stood no chance. He was 42 years old at the time, bald and naturally pale, wearing his priest attire, strolling the ancient kingdoms of breathtaking architecture. You couldn't fault this man even if you tried. Squeaky clean record, no foul play, no ulterior motives. He existed solely to serve the gods and protect humanity. Noctera, the moon goddess, was heavily impressed by Zalkath's efforts as well as the work he did. She was a giant, almost as tall as the colonnade that she resided in. Her hair was long and white, and her draped gown changed color according to the phases of the moon. But her eyes were so beautiful and mesmerizing that one could not help but be smitten by her gaze. One night, Noctera summoned him to her colonnade inside her palace. After every 5 years, the moon goddess would bestow divine power upon Zalkath. This divine power could come in the form of strength, speed, good health, long life, anything beneficial to the priest king. The blessing or procedure, however, would only take place during a blood moon. The blood moon was a total lunar eclipse, a time when Noctera's power was the strongest, though the blood moon's effect on humanity was also dependent on her mood. When the goddess was in a bad mood, the blood moon served as a supernatural omen, a time where the veil between the living and dead was lifted, a time where misfortune and hardship happened. But if Noctera was in a good mood, the blood moon would serve as divine power, luck, and everything positive to the human world. Now, for the first time standing in front of the goddess of the moon, Zalkath trembled. His confident aura and smirk of righteousness had disappeared into the night, like the cool breeze blew it away. He perspired and interlocked his thumb into every crevice of his fingers. How nervous, afraid, and petrified he was, for he kept a dark secret, hoping Noctera wouldn't find out. Few nights ago, there was an exorcism that went terribly wrong. The possessed lay on the church table talking in a deep, foul voice that sounded so frightening. Zalkath stumbled over his words. He faced a demon like no other, and for the first time, he felt outmatched. The victim's bones snapped and dislocated as he hurt her throat, gargling blood. Her eyes cried with tears of pain and agony, but the demon inside smiled. It smiled despite knowing it would be sent back to hell very soon, but that was part of the plan. Every demon hated the Priest King, knowing they wouldn't be able to defeat him. But he was a human after all, and humans can be corrupted. The possessed girl snapped the rope tying her down to the church table, then lunged at the Priest King. The bone in her elbow joint had broken so badly, it pushed through her skin with the blood gushing out. Perhaps a move of desperation? Oh no. The demon controlling the woman shoved her elbow into Zalket's face before he uttered the final words of the exorcism, sending the demon back to hell. But the Priest King spat on the ground profusely. This foul taste, bitter, evil, and sickening lingered on his tongue. No matter how many times he threw up in the bathroom or washed his mouth, the taste of demon blood never left. Since that incident, Zalket had been sneaking away into the possession chamber, a place of which he expelled or tortured demons, then fed on their blood. This became an addiction, one that he hated, one that ashamed his soul and weakened his mind. Hence, that night when the blood moon took place and Noctera cast her divine power onto Zalket, the porcelain skin on her forehead became wrinkly and grey. Where was the white spherical aura that's supposed to surround Zalket, her favorite Priest King? Where was the power that should have been emanating across the land, helping him cross over to the domain of the gods? He fell to his knees, sobbing and asking for forgiveness. He could not lie anymore. Zalket couldn't keep such a vile secret hidden. With tears running down his face like rivers, he confessed to what he had done and why the moon ritual never worked. Noctera was furious. She stood up and slammed her spear onto the ground as her eyes turned the same blood red as the moon. "You betrayed me," she said furiously. The colonnade began rattling like an earthquake struck the land. The sky turned darker than the night itself and the energy felt negative and heavy. The nearby bats flew out of all the surrounding caves and swarmed the colonnade, but they never touched the goddess. They were more frightened than anything. Noctera glanced at the bats flying into the night and pointed her spear at the Priest King and said, "I curse you. You shall be a Priest King no more, nor shall you feel the power of the gods. You will suffer through all of your miserable life. You have a thirst for blood, don't you? Don't you?" Zalket begged and pleaded for her mercy. "I've made a grave mistake," he exclaimed. "Please, please give me a second chance. I've served the gods my entire life and I've made a mistake. Help me, Noctera. Guide me, show me the way, have mercy upon me, but do not forsake me." However, the goddess continued, "You shall not remember the taste of bread or the freshness of water. You will feed on the blood you chose over us, but you will suffer. Those very humans you took an oath to protect will be the same source of your food. You will drink their blood for thousands of years while you suffer the entire time. Oh yes, why should life be wasted upon you? You will look like those ugly creatures hiding in their caves and flying around at night, pale as the overcast sky, looking for your death with every victim you feed on. Be gone, you insect. I do not wish to ever see you again," were the last words Noctera, the goddess of the moon, had for Zalket. His head remained bowed down the entire time, ashamed and defeated. The guards carried him and threw him into the deepest, darkest cave they could find, with not even a flicker of light able to enter. He tried fighting the curse as best as he could. Zalket didn't want to harm any humans. He fed on the bats inside the cave for as long as he possibly could, till there were no more bats left. With no blood to feed on anymore, his skin turned pale, his eyes turned red, and wings pushed out from his back. How long was he going to stay hungry for? How long was he going to suffer this way? Then, Zalket flew out the cave, controlled by the bloodlust, feeding on the humans that he once swore to protect. He was a vampire, the first of his kind that spread the curse like a disease. His humanity was lost, and while the gods could interfere and stop his wrath, this was ultimately his punishment. However, the gods seemed to have forgotten the demon blood coursing through his veins. They had forgotten his sobbing pleas on his knees, hoping they would forgive him. They never expected to have created a monster. And so they left the world, abandoning not only him but humanity itself. The moon goddess looked down upon Earth as a tear rolled down her eye. She couldn't control her emotions during the blood moon. She could not take back the curse cast upon her favorite human. To her, he was now Nazdukh, the name that explained everything. Nazdukh, the Forsaken. Nazdukh then established himself as the scariest vampire that ever existed. When he fed on humans, he had a choice. 1, to spare them, which meant only drinking a small amount of blood. 2, to turn them into vampires, or 3, kill them. Nazdukh, most of the time, chose the latter. The wisp of dark smoke traveling in the wind, the sound of large wings echoing throughout the night. They knew the vampire was coming, yet they couldn't stop him. Elves, dwarves, hunters, witches, warriors of the strongest kind in numbers found his cave. They entered as prepared as can be, but none of them walked out. Hell had also sent demons and monsters to find him, but they never returned either. Maybe they had forgotten that Nazdukh was once a priest king that fought demons with holy brass knuckles when he was just a human. So how much stronger did he become now? What went on in that cave, what he did to them, how he did it, remained a mystery. But folk heard the screams from that cave. They heard the limbs being torn apart with ease. They heard the sound of blood being splattered onto the cave walls. They heard the flesh being chewed and spat. More than 50 years passed and Nazdukh wasn't seen or heard of anymore. Some said they spotted him in the same cave, some said he died, while others believed the vampire priest king of the night to be a myth. But one particular story circulated the land. Maybe just wild conjecture, but folk told a tale of how the woman in the castle near Cascada was the one to kill him. Cecilia Rosenthal, they called her. That name might not mean much now, but that character will serve as a vital role in part 2 of this video. Centuries passed and people feared a new up-and-coming vampire they called Dracula. Nazdukh was forgotten until the Redwater Massacre. The screams of the village folk echoed throughout the land. Dracula's hisses and growls traveled into the deepest of caves and largest woodland regions throughout. That noise woke Nazdukh from his sleep. When the village was silenced with bodies laying everywhere that one couldn't even find a footing, Zalkat passed through. He wondered who would be capable of doing such a thing other than himself, of course. Then in the distance he saw a monstrous bat-like creature flying away into the night sky, which happened to be Dracula, someone he had no knowledge of at the time. But on the ground at his feet, Nazdukh noticed a man that reminded him of himself in his young days. A man that was killed by Dracula. Killed, not turned. A man with long black hair, short beard, with village clothes on, and died with his fists still clenched. Nazdukh turned him over and looked at his body for a while. This was no warrior, he thought. This human never even had a shred of strength in his body. This man was weak and yet he chose to fight for his village. It had been so long since the vampire elder smiled. A smile that wasn't evil, cunning, or frightening. A smile that came from Zalkat rather than Nazdukh, showing the utmost respect. The vampire elder placed his hand onto the deceased man's chest and said, "Maybe you could right the wrongs that I never could. Maybe one day you would be the one to put me out of my misery." And so Nazdukh sunk his fangs into the neck of the man lying on the ground, turning him. the vampire elder flew away into the night, returning to his cave, never to be seen again. The villager he turned was a locksmith. That man was Fesliyan Hunt. Mercer Fesliyan, much like Ragnar Leifson, was a warrior in his own right. The work he did, however, was far from noble and admirable. The customer pointed the finger and Mercer took the lives of those being pointed at, only if the coin was right, of course. He lived on an abandoned farmhouse containing weapons of all sorts for his work. He was a big man, so large that the width of his shoulders pushed against the doorframe. His hair was black, long, and always in a ponytail. While he shared similar physical attributes to the vampire cop as a human, Mercer's personality was the opposite of Fesliyan Hunt, a perfect display of yin and yang. They say no one is born with evil, hatred, and prejudice. Those are the things taught to us from society. Mercer, however, was the exception to that rule. Mr. Fesliyan took the lives of his own parents when he was very young, simply because they scolded him for wrongly doing a chore around the farm. The murder weapon, a pickaxe, and the bodies looked like mutilated animal carcasses. His hatred for humanity stemmed deep within his soul. Every day, looking in the mirror, he despised himself so much that he scarred his own face with a blade, just so he could look like something more than a human. But deep down, behind that veil of emptiness in his eyes and shy demeanor, Mercer was born a monster. One day, the job he took went horribly wrong. It was an ambush in which Mercer's skills were tested. From the group of 15 hunters, Mercer took out 12 of them, with the remaining 3 dealing the finishing blow. They used spears and treated the mercenary as if he was a wild boar. No one knew who sent these hunters, but conspiracy in the village told stories of how Mercer's relatives were the ones taking revenge for Mr. and Mrs. Fesliyan. Mercer never had a proper burial. His body was thrown in the woods, left to rot and turn into dust, merging with the woodland soil. However, in the woods in front of Cascada, things that were dead did not stay as such. The farm was eventually sold to a family of 5, with the nearby village prospering. It seemed quite poetic that since Mercer's death, the village now looked beautiful. It seemed like the darkness and the foggy days and nights were only fouler simply because the mercenary lived there. Though on a dark, cold winter's night, the mother of the family of 5 crocheted by the table next to the fireplace inside the farmhouse, looking out the window now and again. She saw a man built like a brick wall running through the farmland, spooking the cattle. He was pale and moved like the wind, almost as if her eyes were deceiving her. His hair long and untidy, blowing in the cold winter wind. The strange inhuman being killed the cattle with his bare hands and then began eating them. At least that's what it looked like. The father of the family fired a shot with his rifle, which scared off the pale man, retreating him to the woods. When they gave the report to the constables, no one believed the family, not because of the cattle mutilation or the cannibalism-like behavior, nor was it the fact that the man moved so fast he seemed blurry. Their report was solely discarded because of one main point. The man they described that night devouring their cattle matched the description of Mercer Fesliyan. The family of 5 never told a lie that night. Mercer Fesliyan was indeed the one seen in the farm, but he wasn't human anymore. He was a vampire. Friday night later that week, the police found the bodies of the family near the farm. Their skin like melted wax and their blood drained from their bodies. But here's where things get rather interesting. No one, including Mercer, knows who turned him into a vampire. That night his eyes jolted open, he felt a bite mark on his neck. Besides hearing the surrounding heartbeats nearby and the blood flowing through the village's veins, Mercer remembered nothing else of that moment. Then he established himself as a skillful vampire, doing the same job he did as a human with higher stakes. No pun intended. His skills as a mercenary amplified. heightened senses like hearing and sight, faster movement with speed that made him look like a blur or sometimes glitching. Mercer's vampire reputation spread like wildfire, not because of the big names that he took out, rather the methods of his work. When bodies turned to mush, people knew Mercer was the one responsible. Not even the largest bears across the land would leave their victims mangled to such an extent. From axes, choppers, knives, wooden bats, his victims experienced the most amount of pain imaginable before their deaths. Though, his favorite weapon was now part of his body, 9-inch razor-sharp claws for fingernails that extended whenever he needed them. Witnesses would report a humanoid bat-like creature, pale in color with large reddish wings, flying over towns and villages at night. Sometimes they would even mistake him for Dracula. Those who encountered him up close and personal never lived to tell the tale. When Mercer realized how much power he obtained from being the Vampire Mercenary, the night itself belonged to him. They called him the Assassin of the Shadows. Despite Cascada having a vampire infestation, whenever the mercenary walked through the city, no vampire, male or female, dared to even look his way. However, as big and strong as he may have been, as ruthless and unforgiving as this vampire monster was, he struggled internally. Voices echoed inside his mind of not being good enough. Flashbacks of his father scolding him, his mother abandoning him, and people who he once thought were his friends laughing at him. Physically, he was strong indeed, but his mind was fragile and weak. He needed protection. Mercer wanted someone to willingly accept him for the despicable monster that he was. And so he met Dracula. Vlad Tepes, the narcissist, wove his words like a silk thread, wrapping them around Mercer's mind until his own thoughts seemed to dissolve into the background. Dracula didn't demand control, he made it feel like a gift. His voice was never raised even on the angriest of days. A whisper, slightly gruff and monotone. A gentle suggestion here, a carefully placed doubt there, just enough to make Mercer question his own instincts. Vlad Tepes took him to the castle and gave him a home. He would say things like, "You know I'm the only one looking out for you." This sounded so condescending to an outsider, but to Mercer it was warm, kind and soothing words that he wanted to hear from his father. "You're too trusting. People will take advantage of you." Such irony dripped like poison from Dracula's tongue, but the weak-minded Mercer never saw it. The Vampire Mercenary only nodded, grateful for the illusion of protection. Whenever doubts flickered in Mercer's eyes, Vlad Tepes responded with disappointment rather than anger. "After everything I've done for you." A sigh, a well-timed look of hurt. "And I thought we were closer than that." Guilt settled in, heavy and suffocating until resistance crumbled. And just like that, the weak-minded individual became Dracula's puppet, mistaking control for guidance, mistaking manipulation for love. Just like that, Mercer, the Vampire Mercenary, who might even be on the same level of strength as Dracula, bowed down to the Vampire Lord, working for him as his right-hand man. Mercer Vexley was then tasked to hunt down werewolves, special-class werewolves to be exact. He never knew much about them or why they were so special, only that Dracula had been communicating with Hell directly, guiding him on his plan for an infested vampire world. They believed a special-class werewolf, much like Belru Caesar, the legendary werewolf, would be the one to destroy all things evil in this world. Of course, at the time, the special-class werewolves Ragnar Leifson and Victor Humbridge weren't born, and Belru was already dead. Though, back then, Mercer found every humanoid werewolf that he could and slaughtered them in the most brutal way possible. Alphas from their packs, cursed werewolves, men born with the lycanthropy affliction, were all falling like flies. The mercenary would grab a chunk of their fur with his fist, rip it out, and stick it on his long coat given to him by Dracula. Mercer no longer had a personality of his own. His behavior was more of an obsessed people-pleaser. Then, when the real special class werewolf was born, Ragnar Leifson, Dracula's wife Francesca had passed away from cancer. Dracula too fell ill shortly after with blood contamination in his body, then fell into a deep slumber for 50 years. Mercer in the time being was in charge and took it upon himself to revamp the castle, not with renovations, rather with fresh blood for his new leader, Dracula. He captured innocent human beings and left them chained up in Dracula's dungeon. They had tubes and pipes stuck in their body, flowing all the way up to the master bedroom like a windy maze. The human blood was used to feed Dracula while he slept and counter the blood contamination in his body. When the humans in the dungeon turned into melted wax blankets from having every drop of blood drained from their bodies, Mercer would abduct more people and the cycle repeated. He tortured them. He took out all his pain and anger on innocent folk, using the most grotesque methods too frightening to speak of. Now, while I can't and won't go into detail with that, to understand how evil Mercer really was, his victims weren't just men and women. However, when Dracula never got better after 5 years, Hal sent Cornwood, Caleb, and Connolly to help the higher vampire recover. Cornwood, Caleb, and Connolly, better known as the Wizards of 3. How can mere humans be worthy or talked about in the same video as the likes of Dracula and Mercer? Surely their standard of evil could not possibly match a vampire lord and mercenary. Besides, you hear vampire hunters and wonder, why are they even under the villain list? But I've said this before and I will say it again. Far more frightening than vampires, werewolves, and monsters alike are none other than humans. Lyka Graves, age 34, and Lucian Graves, age 35, are siblings that grew up during a very difficult time in Redwater when the supernatural was at an all-time high. There were many battles and wars taking place in the land, hunters fighting against monsters, elves and dwarves forming an alliance with man trying to eradicate the vampire infestation in Cascada. While most elves and dwarves came back in one piece either from retreat or carried through the river, all hunters that fought for their land never returned. Redwater was filled with grieving widows, widowers, and orphans. Lyka and Lucian Graves were somewhat part of the latter. They weren't orphans per se, but they sure as hell felt like it. Having lost their father in battle, their mother was still alive but never around. Their village for a while was taken care of by the elves and dwarves till the land of Freya was under attack. Therefore, they had to leave. Redwater in their absence struggled, not because of the lack of work, rather overcoming their grievances to wake up every morning. While growing up, the two siblings held anger and malice in their hearts. They wanted to exterminate every vampire that plagued the land. No matter how hungry they would practice day and night in their dark and cold village, perfecting their skills. Hand-to-hand combat, weapon training, concoctions in books that were sold by witches, anything useful for them to learn, anything they could find. Lyka and Lucian were only 12 at the time. They read old journals from previous hunters outlining the weaknesses of vampires. Sunlight burned vampires or sometimes even weakened the strongest. Holy symbols, crosses, and holy water worked on some but not all. Hunters needed more investigation with this weakness. Garlic repelling or poisoning them was just a mere myth. Silver did however burn their skin and weaken their powers, mainly their speed, much like werewolves. Fesliyan Hunt, however, does not share this weakness. When he fought the werewolves in Houndsville, he used silver chains to kill them. This aspect will be explored further in Book 2. Wooden stakes pierced their hearts and killed vampires, but realistically, any sharp object could be used. Wooden stakes were just cheaper and easier to make. Vampires cannot enter homes uninvited, particularly good to know when ambushed. Find a nearby house and wait till sunrise. Fire burned them more severely than normal. Similarly, colder weather slowed them down. That's why Fesliyan Hunt couldn't enter the land of Freya when hunting down the White Wolf. Last but not least is an interesting one. Mirrors. Unlike vampires from original folklore that do not reflect in mirrors, vampires from Cascada appear normally. However, if the mirror has the correct binding symbols engraved in the corners, the vampire could be permanently stuck, with only the reflection living inside the mirror. When Lyka and Lucian reached the ages 16 and 17 respectively, they had hunted down their first vampire. Rumors spread of a vampire feeding on humans in the woods of Redwater, pale skin, sharp fangs, slender and shadow-like. They spent more time planning their attack, and that's what made them dangerous, pinpointing everything the vampire could do to them and formulating attack patterns to counter that. With crossbows and wooden stakes in bags carried over their shoulder, they entered the woods of Redwater. Lyka used her crossbow, firing wooden arrows into the vampire's neck, but her aim wasn't as good as it was now. Lucian tackled the vampire and stuck a wooden stake in his heart, but he never came out unscathed. However, it did feel good. It felt like they were on the right path of clearing out the vampire infestation. This was the beginning of avenging their father. But with so much of hatred in their hearts, their judgment was clouded. Something so simple and logical had completely missed their thoughts. What if not all vampires were bad? What if, just like people, the innocent and good-hearted vampires were painted with the same ugly brush they used for those who've done wrong? As they got older, they added more vampires to the hit list. They became unstoppable. Villagers and townsfolk praised them. Elves and dwarves were impressed, and for the first time after a very long time, folk felt safe again. But one dark, foggy night changed everything. Lyka and Lucian caught a glimpse of a slender being walking with two children near the woods at night. The siblings were infuriated. Now these monsters were targeting children. Maybe they always were, but the vampire hunters never thought about it. They hunted down the man and killed him the way they would get rid of a vampire. But this supposed vampire never fought back. No super speed, no sharp claws, and no super strength. The two kids fell onto the man's chest, crying like their souls were snatched away from their bodies. "Father, Father," they shouted, trying to wake him up, but he didn't. That night, the vampire hunters killed an innocent man. That night, they failed at their deductions. But did they realize it? Then the quiet poison seeped into their minds, distorting reality and numbing their soul. They were mentally shielded from the pain, but at what cost? Walls had formed in places that should have been replaced by acceptance. They were trapped in a loop of false comfort where problems fester, relationships decay, and the truth had become the haunting ghost of silence. That night in the woods, they left behind everything they strived to be. That was a vampire, they said, repeatedly whispering to themselves. Did you not see his fangs? Did you not see his pale skin? Did you not see the grip he had on the children? Lies, they told themselves. That night, the vampire hunters developed something they never thought they would. Something called denial. The two children remained crying in the woods, the only two witnesses to what Lyka and Lucian had done. What would happen to their reputation now? What happens if word got out to surrounding towns and villages? And so, the vampire hunters got rid of the witnesses. But it never stopped there. Once they crossed that line, they felt power. They felt control. They felt like vampires were not something to be feared anymore. Maybe people should fear them instead. Since that night, they became numb, and that numbness turned them into monsters worse than demons. Lyka and Lucian grew up hunting vampires the way they've trained to do, but their methods were disgusting. They would interrogate humans and good vampires who they believed had any information regarding the weak points of Cascada. Reputation triumphed over cause. Not once did they realize they've turned their very own people against them. Not once did they see how blinded they were by this facade of power they've borrowed. So what were their methods of extracting information? What were the infamous trademarks of torture that made humans and vampires alike so afraid of them? There was something called the rack. Victims were tied by the hands and feet and stretched out until joints dislocated and limbs tore. Bones would pop and muscles would rip slowly. They also used the heretic's fork, which was a metal rod with two sharp prongs on each end that would press upward under the chin, while the other set would press downward into the upper chest. The victim's head was immobilized, sometimes with a leather collar or tied restraints, just so they couldn't move without driving the prongs into their flesh. The third method was called the pair of anguish. This was a metal device inserted into the mouth and private areas, then expanded by twisting a screw. Fourth was the Iron Maiden. This coffin-like device lined with inward-facing spikes. When closed, it pierced the body, but not fatally at first, which allowed the victim to slowly bleed to death. Fifth was the Judas cradle. Victims were lowered onto a sharp pyramid-shaped seat by ropes, the points forced into the private areas again, painful, degrading, and agonizingly slow. Sixth was the Spanish chair. This heated iron chair was embedded with spikes on the seat, back, and armrests. Victims were strapped in and sometimes lit from beneath to encourage confessions. Then they had the scavenger's daughter method. Quite opposite of the rack, this device compressed the body tightly, forcing blood to spurt from the nose and ears. It crushed both the body and spirit. Number 8 was the coffin torture. Victims were locked into a metal cage shaped like a human body and left hanging in public. Birds and insects feasted while villagers just watched. 9 was the wheel. Victims were tied to a large wheel and bludgeoned until bones shattered. Sometimes limbs were threaded through the spikes to be snapped like twigs. And number 10, the crocodile shears. This horrific device was heated and clamped around the male vampire's private area, then yanked, tearing everything off in a single grotesque motion. Just because the vampire hunters are human does not excuse them from being villains. They may not have 9-inch razor-sharp claws for fingernails. They may not have large wings and gnarly fangs, nor do they need to move like the wind. Lyka and Lucian Graves, the vampire hunters of Red Water, had become more frightening than the monsters they've hunted. That wraps up part 1 of the Vampire Cops villain stories. I know I haven't been very active last month. March was a very difficult month for me, but now that I'm back, I will try my very best to be consistent. Thank you all for listening to my stories and for supporting this channel.